at Princeton University. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Alejandro Hope.
Thank you. Well, thank you for those very kind words. Thank you very much to the Strauss Center for this opportunity. Thank you, every one of you, for taking some time of your busy schedule to talk about Mexico and the ongoing security crisis. Let me just start by saying that talking about Mexico is a problem of contrast. No? Maybe recently you heard of this. There was this British think tank that came out with a really bizarre ranking about armed conflicts, of which ones are the most deadly in the world. And they ranked Mexico just behind Syria. And of course, Donald Trump immediately tweeted about that. Now, this was like the combination of all his fears. No, Mexico, Middle East, Islamic. And that created a storm. I actually called the authors of that report morons on Twitter. That's probably uncalled for on my part. But I mean, they actually had to withdraw the whole thing but that leads to an interesting question. How violent is Mexico? How do we rank this? And it's not, let me put it, it's not an easy question, or not as easy as it sounds. Compared to say, regional peers, to Latin American and Caribbean countries, Mexico is kind of middle of the road. Right? It's not too bad. I mean, El Salvador has over 100 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Honduras over 60, Venezuela over 50. Even Brazil is much worse. Even in absolute terms, I mean, Brazil has over 60,000 homicides a year. Mexico has a bit under 30,000. No one in the right mind would think of comparing Brazil to Syria, I guess. Hope so. So yeah, but we compare, say, to countries in the southern cone. Yes, Mexico doesn't look that bad, that good. Say, compared to Chile, to Argentina, Uruguay. But I mean, regional peers were kind of okay. But of course, I mean, that doesn't mean a lot. Being okay in the most violent region in the world is not a very comforting conclusion. The next one, if you actually compared Mexico to, say, OECD countries, then the level of violence comes in focus, much sharply in focus. I mean, compared to the U.S., it's 5 times. The homicide rate in Mexico is 5 times what you have in the U.S. It's actually twice what the U.S. Where the U.S. was at the peak of the crack epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s. And compared to any European country, of course, I mean, it's a completely different world. There's actually in Mexico there are basically the same number of homicides as in all European countries combined. There are more homicides in 1 week in Mexico than what you would have in the United Kingdom in a year. So yes, so however you slice the numbers, however you relativize, I mean, this is a violent country. This is a very violent country. And the problem is, why? Can the next one, please? So, one thing, a way to look at this is not a new problem. This is an endemic. Violence is an endemic issue in Mexico. If you actually look, and in some ways, things have gotten better over the years. But interestingly, if you actually look at the historical data, what you had, I mean, the country that came out of the revolution a century ago was more or less similar to what you would see right now in Central America, with homicide rates in the 60s and 70s per 100,000. That level of violence actually declined very rapidly until the early 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, which is also the period of rapid economic growth in the country. And then it stagnates. It stalls more or less around that level for 25 years. for reasons that we don't understand very well. And then you have a decline, late 90s, early 2000s, and then you have this big spike over the past decade. I mean, I'm 46 years old. What I find depressing about this graph is that the homicide rate right now is pretty much the same as it was when I was born in 1971. That's a pretty depressing thought. But I mean, because yes, there has been something of a long-term pacification process, but that somehow hasn't. We're stuck. Maybe some of you that study economic development have heard of this, the middle income trap. That countries grow to a certain level, and then they are stuck there. Then they don't really make the transition to a wealthy country. Well, this is the equivalent of that. We're stuck in the middle violence trap. We're not as bad as Central America, but certainly nowhere near what you would see in a developed country. And of course, with peaks and valleys, and of course, if things were getting gradually better, there would be much more comfortable. But the fact is, we saw this decline in the 90s and 2000s, and then a return, a reversal to mean over the past decade. Next one. And more recently, I mean, we saw a decline, a very rapid increase between 2008 and 2011, then a decline between 2011 and 2014, and then more recently, we're seeing a very, very rapid increase. There's two things. One is homicide reports, and the other of case files, and the other is victims. It's not the same thing because there might be more than one victim in any given case file. And it's also a moving average, 3-month moving average. As you see, we're seeing over the past year or so, or at least 2 years, we're seeing a very, very rapid increase. Over the past 3 years, homicides have increased by 60%. Yes?
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes. Can people hear me? Or sure. Oh. Does it work?
It's not for the room.
It's not for the room, so I have to speak louder. Sorry about that. I mean, over the past 3 years, homicides have gone up by 61%. That's pretty quick. That's pretty rapid increase. And next one. And in some regions, and that is a national average, in some regions, the spike in violence has been spectacular. Baja California Sur, which is where Los Cabos is, this, and the peninsula, the Baja California Peninsula, homicides have spiked by almost 500% in 1 year. Of course, a small state with relatively unpopulated, but still 500%. You have many places where you have double or even triple digit growth over the past year. And that is creating a very, very complicated situation in place that we're already facing really high levels of violence. Next one, please. So what explains this? And there is not a single story behind this. This is an important. There is not a single factor. There's not a single cause for this. I can tell you a number of short-term stories, of short-term narratives of why is this going, what is happening. One has to do with the fragmentation of criminal groups. About a decade ago, the Mexican criminal underworld was basically dominated by 5, 6, or 7, depending on how you count, large-scale drug trafficking organizations. Most of those gangs, most of those cartels have now imploded. They have fragmented. Why? Because, there has been a kingpin strategy. There have been people, most of their leadership has been either captured or killed. So what you're seeing is an explosion of smaller of smaller gangs that are far less sophisticated in terms of their logistics, in terms of their organization structure, but probably much more violent by dollar of income. They are less connected to drug markets in the US and more connected to things like extortion, like kidnapping, like theft. So you have this explosion and on the ground that is leading to probably to relatively high levels of violence in many ways. Two, as you may have heard, the El Chapo Guzman was finally extradited to the US early in January, one day before the inauguration of Donald Trump as president of the United States. So that probably, I mean, El Chapo Guzman was, of course, the historical leader of the Sinaloa cartel. And that has created a internal struggle within the Sinaloa cartel. And a succession fight. His sons are vying for control. Some of his henchmen were also vying for control until recently. It is far from its peak in terms of influence, in terms of the money it's bringing in terms of its military wherewithal. And at the same time, it's facing internal contradiction. It's facing internal problems. The Sinaloa cartel is facing an external challenge in the name of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is probably right now if not the biggest Mexican criminal organization, close to it. They have grown by leaps and bounds over the past 6 years. They used to be a relatively minor player, exporting mostly meth to the U.S. Now they're growing. They are becoming a large-scale group that is dominant in many regions, and that is fighting for control against Sinaloa in many regions. And that is also creating a lot of violence in some places. Fourthly, there's the issue of heroin, which you might have heard very much about recently. As you know, Mexico, in contrast with Colombia, Colombia was always a one-crop story. It was mostly about cocaine. In Mexico, the story of the drug trade is much more diversified. You have, of course, cocaine that is transshipped from the Andes towards the U.S., but you have marijuana that has been traditionally being grown and trafficked from Mexico to the U.S. You have meth, which a large portion of methamphetamine that is sold in the U.S. is produced in Mexico, and you have heroin, which is also a traditional crop, something of a traditional product, but that has grown significantly as the opioid crisis in the U.S. has evolved. According to the latest data from the National Drug Threat Assessment that is produced every year by the DEA, 93% of all heroin consumed in the U.S. comes from Mexico, can be traced back to Mexico. That was not the case until a few years ago, where at least as much as 50% of heroin actually came from Colombia. So that is creating havoc in the poppy-producing regions of Mexico, which are mostly concentrated. 80% of the poppy production is concentrated in one specific state south of Mexico City, the state of Guerrero, which is a very, very complicated region where state control is very tenuous. So that might also be a driver. There are also two couple of institutional drivers that might be behind this. One is we have had a transition in 21 states at the state level, and that might have produced an unstable environment because you have local law enforcement might have had connections or even deals with criminal gangs, and those deals might have been derailed by a change in government. At a local and state level. Again, this is more speculative, but I mean there might be something there. And finally, the country is undergoing a change in its criminal justice system, from a written inquisitorial system to an oral adversarial system that is something that you may recognize. That is of course, that is a good thing. That transition is, of course, a good thing. That is already producing interesting results. For instance, the prison population is actually going down for the first time in decades. However, for the operators of the system, for prosecutors, for police officers, this transition has been very, very difficult. Because in the old system, the only thing they needed to convict someone was a confession. Now they actually have to prove a crime. They don't like it. Now they have to actually do their jobs. And that is creating a situation where the new system has proven very useful at not sending innocent people to jail. It has not proven, at least, as useful right now as sending guilty people to prison. So there's this ongoing process where the effectiveness of law enforcement is, where law enforcement is facing pressures that it hadn't in decades. And this transition will take a while. Next one. However, having said that, all those are short-term drivers. All those are factors that might be driving the homicide curve up. However, but there are structural factors here, and one of which, at the end of the day, this is a problem of institutional capacity. Yes, there is a social underpinning to violence. Yes, there are socioeconomic factors driving this. Inequality is probably a factor, but it is not mechanic. It is not direct. It is not a direct link. Some places that are very poor are also very safe. This is. Let me give you a really counterintuitive example. The safest country in Central America is Nicaragua, which is also probably the poorest. Because they have a police force that they came out of this revolution in the 80s that is very well implanted in the society, whatever. But it is certainly not. Poverty is not necessarily an extremely accurate indicator of where you're going to find violence. But the state capacity is probably a much better indicator. In the case of Mexico, what we have is that we're not devoting resources, enough resources to meet the challenge of security in the country. Mexico spends about less than half in terms of justice and security expenditures, and this excludes defense outlays. We spend less than half what Colombia does in terms of GDP. Even compared to, say, Canada, which is extremely safe country, we spend less in terms of GDP. So that's surprising. So law enforcement, next one please. Law enforcement and criminal justice institutions are overstretched because they don't really have the money. And that problem has, started to improve between 2004 and 2011, and then it has stalled. For the past 6-7 years, the security budget has not increased in constant terms. So this is a problem. We're not making strides. And but the increase is enough for people to say, well, we have doubled the size of the security budget, and that hasn't made things better. Yeah, no, but still, compared to any metric, we're probably underspending. We're not going to solve the problem just throwing money at it, but money is going to be part of the solution. Next one, please. And more importantly, it's not only that at the federal level we're spending less. Mexico is a federal republic, but at the state level, budgets are actually going down significantly, which is where you have the most problems at the state and local levels. And federal transfers have actually gone down quite significantly over the past 3 or 4 years. And that is a really bad news. Next one, please. So it's not surprising that building, this institutional capabilities has actually stalled over the past few years. The federal police, Mexico had a very, very small federal police until about 2007, about 10,000 men, and they started growing very rapidly until about 2011, 2012, and then stalled. We should be having, the federal police should be by now be around 75,000 men strong, and it's 30,000, which is one of the reasons why Mexico has used its army and its navy for law enforcement purposes. There is no posse comitatus doctrine in Mexico, so in some regions, some of which are very close to this place. Tamaulipas, just across the border. In some places, you will not find any other type of law enforcement except for the Army and the Navy. That is really bad news in many different levels. That creates the risk of gross human rights violations. That creates creates the risk of corruption within the armed forces. That poses all sorts of challenges. That can actually create problems in terms of international law, in terms of international humanitarian law. It is in the long-term interest of the country to develop policing capabilities to not use its armed forces for this. However, that requires building police forces. We're not doing it. And next one. And this is the thing. So, okay, we're going to rely on military personnel for this. Well, it's not growing either. Has not been growing either so what we have police forces that are not up to the challenge, and we have military forces that are completely overstretched and overburdened. So this is not a good situation. Next one. And where we should be seeing an improvement, who should be picking up the slack, it's basically state and local governments. Again, not happening. We're pretty much seeing the same number of state police officers. You saw the numbers. We are basically having 3 times as many homicides as a decade ago. We pretty much have the same number of police officers as we had a decade ago. Again, just putting more boots on the ground will not solve by itself the problem, but it is a necessary part of the solution. In many ways, Mexico is under-policed. Yes, we have over 450,000 police officers around the country, 3 levels, federal, state, local. However, and this is important, most of them are underpaid, undertrained, under control. Next one, please. The local and state resources are grossly inadequate to the challenge. About 97% of all state police officers, which tend to be better paid than municipal police officers, earn less than 15,000 pesos per month. 15,000 pesos per month is $750 a month. That's 97%. And we're asking them, and of course most of them do not have benefits of any kind. Most of them do not have life insurance. Most of them do not have medical care. Most of them do not have pensions. And we're asking them to risk their lives. So this is a problem, and of course leads to corruption, but more importantly, it leads to a lot of turnover. It leads to you lose capacity. And you need to retrain people constantly. It creates all sorts of bottlenecks. And again, we're not seeing this improve. Next one. And in many ways, the whole system, even if you move from policing to the criminal justice system, the whole system is completely overstretched. The whole system is completely overburdened. This is a very This is a very ironic situation. Let me put it this way. About 94% of all crimes in Mexico are not reported. 94%. Or when you have 6%, out of 6% that are actually reported, only 1 in 7 actually are cleared by an arrest. Which basically means that 99% of all crimes in Mexico go unpunished, by definition. But even when we're only punishing about 1% of all crimes, the whole system is overburdened. Prisons are overpopulated. This is crimes per year that every prosecutorial employee needs to deal with. This is, crime scene experts, over 1,000 per. Their caseload is about 1,000. There's no way they're going to deal, and they're going to be adequately. Prosecutors, over 600. Over 600, think of that, 646 cases per prosecutor. 2 per day. There's no way they're going to deal adequately with this. Next one. So, now what? This is at the end of the day, the problem of security in Mexico is not technical. We kind of know, what a competent police force looks like. It's not that difficult, or a semi-competent police force looks like. We kind of know what an adequate prosecutor should be doing. We know what a more or less humane prison looks like. It's not that we don't know. It's not a question of know-how. It's not either a question of fiscal resource. It's not a question of money. Mexico is the 12th largest economy in the world. It should be able to pay for itself, to pay for a competent, relatively competent police forces. Other countries have done it of similar income level. The problem, so it's not a fiscal, it's not that the country cannot pay for this. It's a political issue. This has to do with what are the politics. This is the problem of security in Mexico is mostly about accountability. Nothing happens. This goes way beyond security. It is that the political system is not responsive to demands from citizens because nothing happens if you don't respond.
May I interrupt?
Sure.
May I interrupt?
Sure.
Okay. What? Okay. Should I ask a question?
Yeah, I'm almost done. I'm like, or you want to ask here? Okay, fine.
Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, this language we're using about, a similar GDP seems so primitive. The GDP of Mexico cannot be compared to, in my experience, the GDP of other countries. The GDP itself is like a cauldron of activity, and if much of that activity is illicit, how are you going to compare it apples to apples? It's not an apples. It's not a.
No, but compared to, okay, fiscal resources, but the budget.
But the transactions themselves are black market, like.
But yeah, but most of the transactions are not black market. Let me put it this way: the Mexican government has a budget of about $200 billion a year.
To my ears, that doesn't really seem like a good statistic to really work with. It just, if it's a corrupt society, and that stretches into the United States. Where's the money come from? Anyway, that's my takeaway.
Okay, let me just try to. In a way, you're correct. It's not. It's not a question of money. And this is what I'm trying to get at. It's not like the country could not potentially provide relatively decent public services in this area. It's not beyond the reach. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think you can make. Other countries with similar income level have actually done so. With similar stories of corruption. Here's similar histories of corruption. So why this is happening? And I think that has to do with the politics of this. It has to do with the politics because this is a problem. This is a problem where I find, again, Mexican federalism is extremely dysfunctional in many ways. Because there's states and local governments basically do not collect taxes. Most taxes are collected at the national level and then redistributed back to states and municipalities. That creates all sorts of nasty incentives. All that, and it creates an incentive to not be responsive. You can allow yourself to not be responsive to your own citizenry, because you're not extracting money from them. So, who cares? Nothing. Politically, there are very little repercussions to not doing your job. There are no political repercussions to if, say, you don't reform your police force. There are no political repercussions if the homicide rate spikes. There's actually relatively little evidence that high crime levels actually have electoral repercussions, or are dominant in terms of electoral results. And horizontal accountability is also very, very weak. Legislative oversight over security forces is almost non-existent. Judicial oversight over security forces also extremely weak, or at least nascent. The press is in some, and nationally, it covers stuff, and it has uncovered many stuff. But regionally, in some places, the press has been completely silenced by a combination of state repression and crime, and organized crime. The state of Tamaulipas is an important example of that. You need to change the rules. You need to really change. You really need to change the politics of security if you're going to rebuild the institutions or build the institutions. There are some. I'm not going to go very in much detail in some of these proposals, but again, not a question of money. We probably need more money. Probably 1 point GDP. You probably need to have a specific cabinet level agency or ministry that deal with it. We used to have it, we no longer have it. There needs to be the governing structure. There's a thing called the National Public Safety System, which among other things is the body that distributes transfers to state and municipalities and sets up the rules of minimal standards for police courts and so on and so forth. That does not work very well. You need a different governing structure. And finally, in some ways, you need to centralize some of the processes of creating a police force. Maybe not going as far as creating a national police force, because that also has its own challenges. But at least centralize some administrative processes. For instance, training. We should be training all police officers in national academies. We should be having benefits for all police officers, pensions and the like. There should be a single system. You should be having a equipment bought at the national level, not at local and state levels. I mean, there are a number of processes, and then you can maintain some measure of operational control at the local level. And beyond this, what you need is broader political reform. You need to make the political system much more responsive than it is right now. There are some reforms recently that might work in that direction. For the first time next year, mayors will be re-elected. For the first time in a century, mayors will be able to be re-elected consecutively. So that might change their incentives. Likewise for legislators. There has been a lot of a number of anti-corruption bills have been approved recently. Some new institutions have been created. They are not working yet, but they might, in the near future, they might work and start creating at least some incentives for institutions to work better, or at least creating some measure of accountability in the system. But again, no one should expect this to happen any quickly. The changes, building up a state is a long-term process. Creating the rule of law is a long-term process. We're not going to see a broad-based pacification trend in Mexico for a while, whatever happens. But if we continue not doing anything, which is what we have been doing for the past few years, then the process will end up being much longer and much more painful than it is right now. I'm going to stop right here and maybe take some questions, comments. Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you talk about statistics on violence and homicides versus, for example, versus disappearances, how solid, how accurate do you think those statistics are in reflecting the levels of violence throughout Mexico? I mean, are those pretty accurate, or just generally speaking?
Homicides are probably, crime statistics are dodgy everywhere. Because most crimes anywhere on earth are not reported. Somehow an increase in crime reports might be showing an increase in confidence in the institutions, and not necessarily an increase in the underlying activity. Having said that, homicides tend to be different. The so-called dark figure for homicides, the number of unreported cases tend to be lower for homicides, basically because you have a corpse. The number, having said that, there are still a number of inadequate, the statistics are inadequate in some ways. At least you can, homicide you actually have, again, in Mexico as in most places in the world, you have two sets of data. One set of data comes from the criminal justice system. Some police reports, case files, whatever. And the other one comes from the health system, from coroner's reports. In all countries there is a discrepancy, but usually the discrepancy is that the coroner's reports tend to be lower than than the number from the criminal justice. Why? Because a coroner might say, well, no, this is a suicide, and then the police will come in, investigate. No, it's not a suicide. It was actually a murder. Things like that. In Mexico, the problem we have with homicides is the exact opposite. The numbers coming from the health system are actually smaller, are actually higher than the ones coming from the criminal justice system. That is a problem. That it means that there are a number of cases where you had a corpse where a coroner came in, decided that the cause of death of that individual was a homicide, and no one opened a case file. So yes, I mean there are problems. There are problems with the statistics. It shows in some ways callousness from the authorities, but probably much better than what we had a few years back. And again, we have two sets of data to confront it. Disappearances are extremely tricky. Are extremely tricky set of data because they include. I mean, there's a national database on that, but it is a very problematic database because it includes all sorts of different things. It includes, people that you actually include cases of forced disappearance. Forced disappearance is when you have an authority involved in the disappearance of an individual, which is the most serious cases, or most serious cases. But you also have people that probably migrated to the U.S. or that are actually in prison and were never, and no one actually recorded that, reported that. So it is. I wouldn't use that data set, or if anyone plans to use that, would use it very carefully, because I'm not sure what it's actually reflecting on the ground. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to this point about the statistics about crime. In your point as to how 94% of crimes
Sure.
are not reported, what or how can the government incentivize the reporting of crimes, knowing the low chance of prosecution?
Well, there are ways of doing that. I mean, let me put it. In most countries, most crimes are not reported. In the U.S., it's about 50 to 60% of all crimes are not reported. I mean, how you know that from victimization surveys. But I mean, 94% is pretty high. So how you bring that from, say, 90-something to 70-something? Well, you could, again, what you should be working on is making the process easier. In Mexico, as opposed to the U.S., if someone steals your wallet or whatever, you're a victim of a crime, you don't go to the police. You go to the prosecutor's office. Which is called in Spanish Ministerio Público. And then once you report, you need to be there. It'll probably take you 5, 6, 7 hours to report a crime. People at the agency, at that specific agency, will do whatever it takes to deter you from reporting a crime. I mean, it's for real. They will tell you, do you really want to do it? Yeah. I mean, no. It's going to be useless. It's useless. I mean, they'll tell you. It's and 3, you need to actually ratify the report a few days afterwards. So what you could do is what most countries do, which is let the police do it. Let the police do it, and 2, eliminate this second phase of forcing people to ratify whatever they said. If you do, and there have been some experiments at the local level doing that. In one specific, at least I know one specific city that is doing that. It has tripled the number of crime reports within a year. Yeah. Here and then here. Okay.
Sorry, when you said ratify, what do you mean by that?
I mean, you need, this is, I know this is weird. Okay, you go there and you say, someone stole my wallet. Okay, so there will be someone, a typist, will take your word verbatim, whatever you say. Then you will sign it. They do it in typewriters. Kid you not. Okay, and then a few days later, you will go and say, yes, that happened to me. Why not? Because so as to create a disincentive to frivolous accusations. But of course, created disincentive against all crime reports. Okay, here and then here.
So based on your slide where it says where do we go from here, the 4 recommendations that you put forward, whose recommendations are those? Are they a pro-reform group, yours,
Mine.
government? Okay.
You had a question then?
You mentioned policy. I was wondering if on your menu is separation of church and state strengthening.
Oh yeah, I mean that's not church and state. Yeah, Mexico is a pretty unreligious country in terms of the church-state relationships.
I only ask because it seems like that's a solution that is one promoted quite frequently in broken places.
Yeah, I mean this is not. I mean Mexico has had pretty strict separation of church and state since the 19th century. So, and it's actually, I mean, the state has actually been extremely unreligious for many decades.
I've never met too many atheist Mexican Americans. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, but still, you cannot mention the word God in any official document in Mexico. So yeah, maybe, but I mean, legally, I mean, there are relatively strong safeguards.
Just asking.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
yeah.
I wanted to ask, we spoke earlier about how each state has its own
Sure.
police force, each state has its own
Yeah.
code of criminal conduct. But then, are there able to be, the way that the justice system is set up, are there able to be reforms, nationwide reforms in policing, say community policing, or salary increases to avoid corruption, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that has actually been the core of the debate on policing over the past. There's one school of thought is that you need to pretty much get rid of municipal police forces and centralize it into 32 state police forces. That might make sense, I mean, at least on a theoretical level. However, making it happen administratively is very, very complicated. There are about 1,800 different police forces in the country. That sounds like a lot until you find out that in the U.S. there are 19,000. And I think there's some virtue to decentralization of law enforcement. One, yes, you might have corruption at a one place, but that at a local law enforcement, but that affects that municipality. If it's state level force that becomes corrupt, then the problem is much bigger. But there are ways, but the other, so that is one way of solving it that has been proposed that politically is not feasible, because basically you're telling mayors, you know what, you're going to relinquish your police force, and B, you're going to relinquish your police force, and B, you're going to pay for policing. So that creates a budgetary constraint. And the other way of thinking about this is creating national standards, not only for police officers individually, but for police forces. Can you meet certain standards in terms of recruitment, in terms of training, in terms of equipment, in terms of internal affairs, in terms of other metrics? If you can't, then you don't have your own police force. That function passes to the next level of government. That also requires constitutional rejigging and requires a budgetary model that can sustain that. But I'm guessing that politically that is probably easier. But still, given where we are in the electoral process, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. Yes, here and here.
I was wondering if you could talk about the surge in murders and assassinations
Sure.
of journalists in Mexico.
Sure.
What's kind of the leading causes there and the perspective behind it? Is it sort of institutionally sanctioned, or is it organized crime, or is it?
Both. I mean, there have been about 70 journalists have been killed since 2000, more or less. Most of them work for local media outlets in places that about 20%, about 30% are in 2 states. All those cases are in 2 states. In some cases, the murders might be politically motivated. In others, they might be more connected to organized crime. In other places, the distinction between those 2 things is very difficult to make. There has been a mechanism to protect journalists for a few years, and actually there's specific legislation for that purpose. That hasn't really worked. It is not proactive. You only have journalists only receive protection after they're threatened, after they actually receive threats, and the protection they receive is grossly inadequate in many cases. That also includes human rights activists have also been targeted. It is, again, it's one of those issues where we know what to do. Mexican authorities kind of know what to do, but they don't do it because again, going back to the question of accountability. Even relatively prominent journalists have been killed. Most recently, the director of an award-winning newspaper in Sinaloa, a guy that had received prizes in the U.S. and the guy was murdered in broad daylight. Again, and nothing happened. That's again the issue of accountability. Have questions? Other questions here and other here?
In the states of Mexico that have military conducted law enforcement activities,
sure.
You said that the military can be more prone to corruption.
No. What I'm saying is, if the military is doing, it's in the barracks, it's in their barracks, then the risk of corruption is less intense than if you are patrolling the streets. Okay. That's what I'm claiming. Yes, we have had some cases of corruption by military officers driven by that. And there is one reason, the military themselves don't want to do it. They really think that that's not their job.
Are they more susceptible for any reason you think than the actual
this is because, at least the top brass recognize that this creates a lot of organizational challenges. One is that soldiers and personnel serving in some states actually get bonuses from state authorities. So you have a pay scale that is not the same across the country, which again creates all sorts of bad incentives within the organization. So that is a problem that is more systemic than just taking a bribe. Okay.
So I kind of have a 2-part question. The first part relates to you were talking about some of the short-term consequences of the criminal justice reform, and I think many experts, including yourself, I'm sure you would think in the long term this is probably going to have some positive impact.
Sure.
So looking at it on the longer term spectrum, how can we measure progress in terms of the criminal justice reform, and what areas should we be focused on? And my second question has to do with when we were talking about the judiciary. You mentioned how they tend to be overburdened,
sure.
Underfunded, understaffed.
Sure.
One strategy that we've seen is creation of some of these special prosecutors' offices, sure. to address some high-impact crimes.
Sure.
What other reforms or innovations do you see that might be able to address some of these failings in that area?
Oh, okay. Some of the indicators are arguably the use of pretrial prison. One of the hallmarks of the old system was that everyone that was indicted was sent to prison. So that overburdened the prison system and created and overburdened the system itself. That is one. I would argue that one argument, one indicator. Another indicator is how much courts are sending or diverting people to other means of solving conflict or solving disputes. Things like mediation, things like reparation of the laws, things of that other mechanisms that do not necessarily involve a day in court, which is one of the premises of the new system. That so as to unburden the system. Three, satisfaction. I mean, there's been some people that are working, for instance, in terms of the legitimacy of the system. They're actually asking prisoners, people in prison, do you think your trial was fair? And interestingly, that is one metric where the sense of fairness has gone up quite significantly. And since the system was adopted gradually in different regions, we have kind of a natural experiment there. And that is one area where you actually have interest. The system became, in the sense that since they saw the judge, since this was more transparent, was more rule-based, the sense of fairness that the punishment they got was somehow legitimate increase. And I mean, there's a large literature out there about legitimacy and the judicial process. So that is another. As to innovations, there was a reform in 2014 to make prosecutors, attorney general's offices, both at the national and the subnational level, autonomous. That, at least, I mean, the idea there is to depoliticize some of the process, part of the process, and it might lead to some innovation on the ground. We're not seeing it yet, but we might. They might become at least more willing to try some different things. Yeah, there was some other. Yeah.
Kind of piggybacking off of
Sure.
what you said, you spoke about the procedural reforms, and I'm wondering if another indicator of improvement could be the rate of cases acquitted due to evidential mishandling and things like that. We can look at prosecutorial misconduct and see if that this opens the door to a lot of data-based, data-driven policy analysis that was not really possible under the old system. Something else? Another question? Here and then here.
Are there notable trends among murder victims in terms of gender breakdown, age range, nationality?
Yeah, 90% or so are male. Most of them are young, about 2/3 are under 40. Most of them are poor, about 75%, and most of them are did not complete their basic education. So it's the young, it's male, young, poor, uneducated. Those tend to be the murder victims, which means that, except for the male part, they tend to be from politically marginalized groups, which means that they're not very visible. Compared to, say, kidnapping, which is a crime that affects more middle-class people, the response of state authorities is much weaker. In case of homicides, there's a national anti-kidnapping commissioner. There's not a national anti-homicide commission. Tells you a lot about what the priorities are. There was some other questions here.
Yes. No, go ahead. Okay. I was wondering if the barriers to expanding the police force were more related to the fact that people aren't willing to become police officers due to the low pay, or if it was because of a lack of recruitment efforts on the part of the state because of the lack of funding.
I would say, yes, there's, low pay. Pay is, since you're paying very little compared to a risk you're bearing. Yes, that is a problem that creates a problem for recruitment. There's a different problem, which is that beginning 6 years ago, now if you want to become a police officer, you have to be vetted. There's this process called the control de confianza. You have to go through psychological tests, you have to go through medical tests, you have to go even through a polygraph. And that has created a massive barrier to recruitment. In some places, only 1 out of 12 candidates will actually make it. But of course, I mean, if you multiply it, I mean, you say the country needs 400,000 police officers and at least needs to replace at least half of those, then it probably needs 2.5 million people or a certain demographic profile that actually want to become police officers. I'm not sure we have that. So that is created. That is something that was put in place with all the good and with very good intentions. Let's try to vet out people that are in cahoots with organized crime. Fine, but that has created a massive bottleneck.
Yeah, I have a question about I know the U.S. assistance over the years with the
Sure.
Media Initiative is focused on kind of supporting some of the rule of law and
Sure.
training new people across the
Sure.
prosecutorial system.
Sure.
Do you think that's been effective or useful or more of a drop in the bucket in terms of the broader?
Well, I think, I mean, the jewel in the crown of the Merida process has been the training of the criminal justice personnel in the criminal justice system and the assistance for the transition to the new system. And I think it's been very helpful. Pretty much everyone in this, all the operators on the ground will tell you that it has been useful. And it has been, but as with everything with Merida, it's too small to really change the equation. It's not more than, I mean, the Merida is now what, probably not more than $150 million a year. At its peak, it was probably 300 million. There was never more than 2 to 3% of Mexico security spending. So, yes, very useful in its own terms. Very effective in some programs have been very effective, but they're very small. Yes. Okay.
So, in the context of the upcoming Mexican presidential election, how this situation will affect the electoral process, or
I'm not sure. I mean, in 2012, everyone was expecting security to dominate the elections. It didn't. For good and bad reasons. Good reasons that we didn't have high-profile violence against political actors, as, say, Colombia had in the early 90s. Bad reasons is that no one wanted to touch this. This was too toxic. This was seen as too toxic. And anything you could say was going to be a bad answer. I fear that this is going to be similar. That in spite of this, survey after survey tells you that Mexicans think security is their biggest concern. More than the economy, more than jobs, more than corruption, it's security. And yet, the political system is not dealing with this. Because this is a problem, this is an important problem. Because say you are mugged somewhere in the outskirts of Mexico City. Who do you blame? The mayor, the state governor, or the president? Or maybe all three of them. And they might belong to different parties. So who you punish? Again, back to the question of accountability. So my guess is that yes, all candidates will make boilerplate proposals about security and leave it at that. Yes. Dime.
Bueno, lo voy a decir en español, lo voy a decir. El año pasado también habló en nuestra clase y me acuerdo que yo le pregunté porque el...
No, yo no fui, ¿eh? Bueno,
y el gobernador que acaba de entrar a Tamaulipas había dicho que iba a mandar a oficiales a entrenarse aquí en Estados Unidos y luego iban a regresar. Y usted dijo que si el sistema estaba corrupto y estaba roto, de nada servía. Entonces, yo me pregunto cuál es la diferencia entre entrenarlos en Estados Unidos o entrenarlos en el centro, o sea, como del país.
Bueno, no, a ver, ok. Ok.
La segunda parte de la pregunta. La columna, la que hizo la semana pasada, uno de los puntos que mencionó decía aprender y enseñar paciencia.
Sí.
Entonces, a mí aquí me entra un poco en el tema personal. Por ejemplo, Tamaulipas, ¿cuánto tiempo más No, porque ¿a qué se debe el olvido, en su opinión? ¿Verdad? El bajo padrón electoral, porque
Okay, let me try to ask. I mean, the question is, if I get it, does it make a difference for police officers to be trained in the U.S. or trained somewhere else? By itself, no. I mean, because training is just part of the answer. It needs to come with, say, a civil service creation of a civil service protections for police officers. It needs to come. You need to protect them, to give them some job stability. You need to pay them recently. You need to give them strong benefits. You need to improve internal affairs. You need. I mean, there are a bunch of things. You cannot. This is an important. There are no magic wands. There are no shortcuts. It is a long process. How long for Tamaulipas? Very long. Why? I mean, that is one very complicated case in Mexico. Why? Because I don't have an answer for that. My intuition is, one, it is decentralized. It is very decentralized, so it's very difficult to mount a response as they did in Nuevo León, for instance. Two, the business community is extremely export oriented, which means external oriented, which means that their needs of law and order are very limited. What they need is a secure corridor between their plant and the border. Beyond that, I'm not sure they care too much. There is a strong connection to organized crime that has been there for decades. The Gulf Cartel was actually born as a bootlegging operation in the 1920s. So they have a long tradition. So will it be? It is Mexico Sicily. So how long for Sicily? Very long. Answer. Yeah, something. Yes.
My question relates to private security.
Okay.
Do you think that there's no actions on the part of Mexico's elite, like raising police pay, improving recruitment, because they can rely on private security for the safety of their own families and themselves? And then secondly, do you think the existence of private security firms in general threatens the monopoly on violence that the state is supposed to have and in some way contributes to impunity?
In brief, yes and yes. I mean, let me put it this way. The fact that the elites can escape from the general mayhem is not good news. It weakens the mechanism of accountability. Whenever we have seen a response, an effective response locally or regionally, is because the business community has actually taken a role in leading that response. Why has it happened? Because it is in places where you have had such a breakdown of public order that they realize that it's not enough, that private security is just not enough. Monterrey, case in point. Is a case in point. There was a one incident that actually was one of the triggers for the response of the business community. There was an attempted kidnapping of the son of a major executive of FEMSA, which is a major corporation, in the American school, in the parking lot of the American school. That is when somehow they realize it's simply not enough, bringing in the Israelis or whatever, Israeli bodyguards, it's not enough. It is, but in many other regions, in many places, the elites seem to think that is enough, that they can, maybe you have read Albert Hirschman, Exit, Boys and Loyalty. If you haven't read that, it is a great book about economic development. Whenever there's a declining quality of any service or any product or whatever, there are two ways of responding to that. One is the market alternative, exit. The other is the political alternative, which is voice, making your voice heard. And ultimately, those two things work as substitutes. If exit is easy, then voice will be weakened. If exit is hard, then you might have people making their voices heard. So to the extent that it is easy to surround yourself with private armed guards, you're going to care less about public safety. At least that intuitively what I would think. Yes, and yeah.
So in the final slide, in your suggestion to rebuild the public safety ministry, can you just expand upon what is the sort of strategy or your vision for that, considering that civil protection in Mexico is a relatively new concept, and we've seen an uprising, well, not necessarily an uprising, but a lot of grassroots groups voice their frustration with state institutions, the lack of accountability, the lack of visibility, as well as the lack of just reaction in general?
I mean, okay, let me give you some background on that. We used to have a public, from 2000 to 2012, we used to have a public safety ministry. That was at least the body that controlled, the agency that controlled the federal police and controlled the federal penitentiary system and other had other functions. That ministry was merged with the Interior Ministry in 2012. But that created the rationale for that is, let's bring in political accountability, let's bring in political control to the security apparatus. That did not pan out because, for a number of reasons, what you had is a bureaucratic monster, a humongous agency that has within its portfolio everything from crime fighting and public safety to a relationship with churches, to migration policy, to dealings with political parties. It's huge. It's a ministry you won't find anywhere on earth. The portfolio is so big. So within that immensity, bureaucratic immensity, the issue of public safety gets lost. And again, no one is clearly responsible for decisions. And that creates again the problem of who's accountable.
My point to that is, couldn't you make a valid argument that public safety in Mexico has been rather contended, and I see your point where in the merging of these two bureaucracies it's only gotten larger, and with Mexico's history with the free and the centralization within that's a valid argument as to why it isn't functioning. But I think my point is, how is what you are suggesting going to translate into?
By itself, it only creates. Let me put it. It only creates at the federal level, which is one level of the problem. It only creates at the federal level at least a politically responsible individual, someone who is actually accountable for things on the ground. Because what we now have, say, the escape of El Chapo Guzman, 2015. No one was clearly responsible for that. Everyone, even the ministry has been, it's my ministry is so big, it's not my job. Or say gross human rights violations by the federal police. There was one particular incident where you had the confrontation with alleged henchmen from the Jalisco cartel. You had 42 people killed in that incident. Did that lead to the resignation of anyone? No. So it is. I think arguably there is a problem of accountability at the federal level. Does that solve the problem of accountability at the state level? No. I agree with that. You need to change other things. And again, most of the manpower, most of the problems are at the local and state at state levels, and that is where you would need to work. Yes.
So I think we're low on time, so last question. I'll be the last question. You've returned a lot to the theme that this is a political problem, and when you look at your slides, a lot of the trends of increasing budget for the federal police or for the army or transfers stop around 2012 when we switched from Calderon to Peña.
Sure.
Perhaps that's the political transition, or perhaps that's when the numbers of the urgency was gone as the numbers were starting to go down.
Sure.
Now that, my question is, now that this year you see the numbers rising
Again.
quickly, have you seen a shift at all in terms of strategy or in terms of policy at the federal level?
Not yet, but at least arguably they're tacitly recognizing that the resources they have at their disposal are simply insufficient to meet the emergency. I mean, at least they're committing significantly more resources for next year. But again, it will only take us, in some cases, it will only take us back to where we were in 2012. So, I guess we're done. Well, thank you very much.